Hello, everyone. You all right? Can you all hear me? Cool. So we do every show. We do something called our Tuesday talks, and these talks can sometimes be about a specific artist in question we're showing, but sometimes we do talks about issues that might come out of some of the artists that we show address in their work. And tonight, we're very grateful to be joined by Francesca Blomfield, whose paintings we are sitting in front of here. Francesca Blomfield is in our show Multiverse alongside an artist, Christopher Batty, and Dustin Peavy, whose work is upstairs as well. And we're also thrilled to be joined by Matthew Collings, award-winning broadcaster, critic, and also artist. And I'll just kick things off with a brief introduction. So this discussion is around the concept of anxious labour and what it means to create work in anxious times. In an age of turbulent politics, late capitalism and ecological collapse, can the production of art mitigate a sense of hopelessness? Can it galvanise us or move discourse forward? And so, first of all, I'll ask the question: really, do we live in anxious times? And if so, does the production of art help us cope with that?
Francesca, what do you think?
What do I think? Yeah, I definitely think it does. I think that sort of the way that, I mean, if you look around at like criticism and what people are writing about, what people are making, I do think that more so than kind of like after postmodernism or like a post like internet or, you know, hyper technological society, we are just very anxious, basically, like everyone is. And I think that that's really, you can see that everywhere in like politics, environment, economic disparity. And I think that the thing about anxiety is it's kind of, it's not a very productive feeling because it's cyclical, so you get trapped inside of it. And I think that there's something quite different to the times we live in now. But then maybe in the past, other people said that there was no other time like the times we lived in. And so we're just repeating that kind of pattern, like speaking in terms of like historicism or something like that. But I do think about art that I see around me, that not just that I'm making, but like my peers are making or other people that I'm looking at. And it does seem like there's become a kind of move to kind of capitalise on that anxiety as a way to maybe dispel it or reject it or get rid of it, because it's very feelings based, and it's also sort of limits action.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, as in like psychological anxiety.
Sure.
Yeah. That's what I think.
So, Matthew, looking back at some interviews you've done, maybe like 20 years ago, during a kind of YBA era contemporary art scene, you've made comments in the past about that scene being quite sort of hollow or daft, say. Are you noticing now that things are more sincere, or I don't know? Do you think that we live in anxious times? First of all, that's probably a good place to start.
I'm not sure what order to put these thoughts in, but primarily I would say this is a time for us of fantastic hope, because there's likely to be a socialist government in the UK, which there's never been in the entire period of the history of Labour. And Labour itself has been mostly rather a reactionary political party, funnily enough. People don't really realise that. And just to have even a mildly socialist guy who runs it, and a set of even mildly socialist policies, which they have, is absolutely revolutionary. And all the signs behind the surface of sort of hateful, hysterical mass media owned by a handful of billionaires are that it's going to be Labour. They're going to win. So I can't think of anything more hopeful than that. I would say that the reason for anxiety is climate disaster, which no one knows how that's going to work out. Death by climate disaster is sort of deeply ingrained into the machinery of capitalism. It's caused by capitalism. It's not like individual capitalists or individual labor people say, oh, well, I'm a bit better than you about how many plane trips I take. The actual processes of capitalism are immediate returns, massive overproduction for immediate profits for a handful of people. No one knows how to deal with that, so that's a good reason for anxiety. But as to what happened 20 years ago, when I interview artists in the period of political complacency, a relatively small part of the world has been politically complacent for 40 years, thinking that there's no left, there's no right, because we all assumed that there wasn't, because what was given to us was pretty much that, So it's not surprising that the art of that time tended towards irony. It's not necessarily so that the art of now tends towards sincerity. It's a bit of a sort of false opposition. But it's, and I take your point that people are interested in a sort of, I would say, a loose expressionism of oil painting, more actually than a sort of anxious type of art. They're more willing to take that seriously now than perhaps 10 years ago. And when people 40 years ago did a sort of a wild oil painting with mighty expressionism, it was impossible to take it remotely seriously as actual feelings. It was much more a sort of very witty and often visually interesting, maybe beautiful sometimes. It was more a sort of commentary on the impossibility of sincerity. So to wrap up all these thoughts, anxiety of labor, the labor of making something. I think when I look at your paintings, I see something that's beautifully constructed and took a long time. And in the making of it is a certain sensitivity, a believable sensitivity. And it arrives at something that couldn't be pre-calculated. It's very much to do with the making, these sort of flowing patterns, these encrusted gobs of paint and the sort of layers of paint. So you're looking at something that's very sort of convincing and worth looking at, even though one couldn't say what the words that appear say or what the meaning is or anything. And I think that is a currency at the moment. And you do it particularly well and with a particular sort of flair and originality. But as I said, it's something that you see in a lot of current painters, and also in the way that painters are not necessarily all that great, like Peter Doig, Crisafilli, and the other one, there's another one who does it. Anyway, they do this sort of painterly, visionary stuff where they imagine that they're princes of dreams, and the oil paint sort of flows and makes a dream on the canvas. Where those painters are taken quite seriously, and whether or not Doig and Ophelia are at the height of their powers at the moment, nevertheless, it's simply accepted that it's in that area that something real could be done. And actually, I kind of agree with that. I think that a manipulated surface where someone's put some effort into it, and almost a sort of old cliche of people who didn't really know much about art, but sort of had a little knowledge of it, where they'd quite like to come across a painter. It looked like the hours had been put in, and when there was a bit of sensitivity, I agree, that is quite good. Mm. So sometimes I'm not with you on the high anxiety. I think in terms of nature, yes, definite reason for it. In terms of art is so complicated. The codes of it are so complicated to read, and what flows into what we do now. It's so difficult. I don't think it's impossible, but it's difficult and laborious to spell out why a certain look becomes a look that people might want to applaud. So I don't know if that was more confusing than enlightening.
Yeah. Well, I think you're coming from a position that's offering a position of hope for the future, as opposed to a position of threat of the future, which I think we've I think we're sort of getting at when we talk about an age of anxiety and stuff like that. What about, so for you, Francesca, can we talk a little bit about art's therapeutic potential for you?
Yeah.
Is that something that you think about much in your work? Has that happened before you start making work?
Yeah, so I think it's interesting what you were saying about that, something that looks like something's taken a long time, and that sort of quite like conventional ideas around labour. And I think it's not a kind of strict, but you also spoke about like hysteria, which I think is quite interesting, because medically speaking, you know, hysteria is something which was used a lot in sort of like older forms of psychiatry to talk about basically very female, in female terms, things which were basically anti-patriarchal or anti-capitalist, or, you know, anti-convention, anti-normative, like get up, go to work. Things that broke with that were described in hysterical terms. So like in 1980, when the invention of anxiety disorders comes into play in kind of medical documents, the word hysterical neurosis like completely drops out. So it basically replaces one thing just by language, not by symptoms. And I think that how we sort of describe something and how we call something is quite interesting, especially in terms of like talking about sort of anxious times. Like I'm quite certain that that there's a kind of hyperactivity to the environments that we live in, especially in industrialised society, where it does feel that there is a sort of like brink of collapse happening, and this has sort of sprung like lots of discourses around like collapsology of like industrial nations basically. And I think that there's something within that that's not entirely negative, because when the end of something comes, something new begins. So there's potential to kind of, as like human beings, to kind of accept the fact that we're not the most important things on the planet, and either in terms of like social structure and also environment, and do something good in terms of like re-engineering. So then when the therapeutic aspect of that comes in, I suppose it comes about intention, and I think that that's something that's starting to make its way into like art production, basically. That we don't live in a kind of like, we don't live in a time where it's entirely comfortable to be pumping out a product that is, say, like a gigantic Baselitz painting. Right. If you see what I mean. Like for him, he can still do that because he's from a different era. But I think maybe for myself, like speaking personally, that is not entirely a comfortable, because as artists, we have to take into consideration like material terms of like production, you know, how this is gonna go, what the lineage of it is, and I feel like that is becoming a concern, which I think is a really good thing, because it means that ultimately the kind of concepts which that stuff represents, like in terms of like a late industrial society, perhaps shifting. So the things it's held on to, which is a sort of patriarchal and quite oppressive ideology, have the potential to change.
Yeah, I think I absolutely agree with what you're saying. If Baselitz is seen in that way, I mean, everyone can be seen within certain frameworks. I think the massive scale and works in series can seem objectionable now. On the other hand, there's kind of interest in some of the current ones who, and this is really going away from therapy, because they don't seem to have any mind or soul or anything, these people. Like Joe Bradley, that American artist. Yeah. He's like an incredibly sensitive painter, I think. And in a way, Baselitz is a sensitive painter too, but the, you know, and then you think Sterling Ruby and that other guy sells them for millions of dollars out of his studio, who's very good, Grotjahn. I don't know if that's how you pronounce it, Mark Grotjahn. Those are big scale artists for billionaires, and they never say anything remotely sort of sensitive or psychically tremulous, or like they've ever noticed a Van Gogh or anything. And they seem absolutely tuned into the machinery of sales. They do a sort of work which is almost like a kind of a deity that has grown from art fairs.
Yeah.
That what's the point of it otherwise? And yet it does have a sort of sensitivity to it. Sensitivity is what we're interested in. You talk about, well, we've raised the issue of therapy. Who would the therapy be before? And what is therapy? Would it be for the artist doing the work or somebody looking at the work?
Yeah, I was talking more in relation to the artist
doing it. Because
when I think about it, I think that the function of it having a kind of like therapeutic or kind of really empathetic intention doesn't necessarily transpire when it becomes a commodity form. If you see what I mean, that's something which always exists, which you have no control over in a lot of ways, unless you become like a folk artist.
But I would say if we sort of look at therapy, given a picture we both seem to agree on, that it's a sort of distorted world that we live in terms of human needs and humanity, really, in terms of a fulfilled humanity. So in some ways, we're saying thumbs up to all that collapsing. But of course, we don't want a bloody collapse. We don't want a century of chaos and murder. So that's why one might be interested in, what are social and political ideas that could ensure a collapse that kind of works, a collapse of the bad and a rise of the good, who knows. But in terms of that, the type of art that you make provides a sort of respite in a way where just disinterested contemplation of those objects would be a kind of therapy. There would be no profit, no commercial profit in looking at them. There'd be no aim other than just the looking. One could be lost in them. And there's something to be said for a type of art where you simply are lost in something, but where the frame of the loss of self and consciousness, or a lot of consciousness, where the frame of it is broadly sympathetic and humane. So the very fact that they are made, that human labour is involved, and they are patterned, and they're organically arrived at patterns, or those set of facts, that's a set of conditions that one feels sympathetic to, humanly sympathetic to. So it's nice to be lost in something like that. That's a kind of therapy. That's a sort of food for hungry souls. And it's different. You're talking about the viewpoint of making something, where you might reject a certain way of making and embrace a different way of making. And I would say that I could extend that to the viewer. The viewer could feel humanely positive to be lost in contemplation of these works that you made.
Well, that's good. Yeah.
It is. Well, it's definitely not evil. I think when Baselitz says that women can't paint, it's unforgivable and it's evil. One should complain about it. I don't think a Baselitz painting is unforgivable or evil. And I think when we look at that when we talk about overproduction and overconsumption and people distorted to believe that the only happiness they can get is a sort of depraved happiness from consumption, and then we apply that to artists who make huge canvases, that makes sense. But if we think of another, Lee Krasner's paintings are very, very large, but they're beautifully organized and sensitive, and there's sort of something humbling about the fact that they were made with one tube of raw umber and half a glass of white spirit, and there's just her, there's no assistance, even though she was doing them in the 70s when Motherwell and de Kooning had factory-like studios. She worked very humbly and did enormous paintings. So enormousness itself is not necessarily objectionable. It's
No,
kind
I
of what,
agree with you,
yeah, it's the
definitely.
vibe of the work.
It's the vibe, and I think that there's something about a psychic charge of a work as well,
I
which,
don't know if that's mine.
yeah, go for it,
Yeah, the sympathetic psychic charge, exactly.
Yeah, and I think that that's very important, and I think that, I don't know, it feels like there is a kind of like emphasis or like a feeling towards that. Like I think about it when I'm making work, like in terms of the type of work that I've chosen to make, because that's not come by accidentally in a lot of ways. Like it's there's like considered factors within
Choices that you make.
yeah, choices that I've made in terms of not necessarily what I want it to look like, but like in terms of the parts of it that I can't really describe that it holds on to. And so like I think, for example, like sort of repetition, that's definitely, you see a lot in kind of art movements where there's a sort of synthesis of craft in a lot of ways within the repetition of things. So either the repetition of thoughts or the repetition of marks or, the repetition of action or object. There is a kind of, I think there is a kind of like subversion of that, like culture industry, like mass produced way of working.
I can think of a woman artist actually who does both things, who's deeply sympathetic in one way, and I find absolutely alienating another, is Yayoi Kusama. That her paintings, when they're that size, or even when they're 8 foot wide or something, when they're made in a way where she's physically making something. There's a certain sensitivity and an experience of making that goes back to the 1950s, and they seem deeply believable. But all the mirrored environments seem deeply off-putting to me. And
Do you think there's a weird sort of exploitation of her relationship to mental health crises?
There may be. I was just trying to think that you made me think of that because you were talking about choices. In a way, she chooses one thing that we've just been talking about, but also chooses the other that seems to be the antithesis of that. Maybe she's true to experience. She's lived a long time, and she's seen that the world is this, the interiority, and it's that spectacle, empty spectacle. I do see a lot of her work as empty spectacle. But as to exploitation of mental illness, a very good theme of this show is mental interiority on the edge of taking off, either for better or worse. There's very much sort of outsider art or prisoner art sense of this guy's very authentic seeming generation of images, and also his the obsessive labour in making the work, and a very impressive artistic control over the colours. Although it's lurid, that's the palette. Within that, there's great subtlety. He's really playing everything off, and he's making and making and making, which we all know somebody mentally ill is capable of doing, and actually quite interested in doing. But rather than mental illness, since we're all sort of mentally ill anyway, we're all made ill by society, by an incredibly depraved, sick society, which the minute you sort of stop for a minute and think, well, what am I being invited to do and think, how the hell did it get like this? How long has that been going on? But actually art's history of interest in those extreme states, or states where you really are in trouble mentally, we would think that's concentrated around the late 18th century and early 19th century, which coincides with the rise of investigations into mental illness as such, as opposed to sort of belief in spirits and shamans and everything. And it's very difficult in the 80s to be Jackson Pollock. So that's what we noticed when they did neo-expressionism. It wasn't really believable. But it's also very difficult to be Van Gogh. One's a guy who's maladjusted in society, which is Jackson Pollock, and he died before the adjustment which might have happened, but just simply didn't make it. He was relatively young. And then one's actually got a serious mental illness where he has no one really knows what it is, but something like fits. It involves something like breakdowns, certainly psychotic episodes. But we can't, my point more is that we can't be them. And in a way, interest in that kind of art becomes very sort of a little bit unbelievable, because it's like the sad clown in kitsch paintings. Petit bourgeois people like that stuff because they don't have any feelings, so they like a bit of sentimentality. But what you've pointed out, and what we've been sort of playing around with for a few minutes, is the idea that perhaps in the last few years there's been a sort of inquiry into whether it is possible to paint in a way that's more like the 1910s, that there's more, or the 1890s or something, where there's a sort of symbolist workability. There could actually be such a thing, or there's an expressionism that is genuinely expressive, as opposed to a mannerism or a comment on an ironic, distanced comment on something. So I would say this is actually an artist who has a perfectly straight history as an artist, but he's also dealing with sort of visions as well.
Yeah.
And I would say in your case, you don't seem remotely unhinged, and your paintings, your paintings don't really say explosion of madness, but they do invite you to go inside. That's the lovely thing about them. The muted color and the organic growing of things, of the fact that they're a bit like the coral world in the Barrier Reef. There's all sorts of things that invite you to, and then they're a bit like the universe. They invite you to go inside in the way that cosmic art does, or in a pop way, psychedelic art, and in a high art way, Van Gogh. And in a sort of funny merging of the two, the whole literature of sort of pop, psychopop, where we kind of want to know what's deep inside us. We don't really want to go mad, but we prefer what's in there to this other neoliberal bullshit, or whatever we used to call it years ago, the world of the straights versus those who might smoke a joint or something, It's funny that should re-enter art. It might just be because the success of the art fairs has been so great that anything is possible, anything is allowed, anything can work and be consumed and can be sold. But if that's always the case, then there's no point in saying it. There's still these tendencies. Where do they come from? Why should there be, in the last 10 years, a growing sympathy for an art that's genuinely explorative of what goes on inside? Not many people despise Hilma af Klint. Those shows came up. You could have thought, she isn't really an artist. That's just a freak. We all thought, wow, that's impressive. Those were really impressive paintings. Maybe she did invent abstract art. Who cares if she did or not? It's more like, wow, what an amazing life to have lived your whole life in a parallel world, and to have got your ideas from spirits, and produced huge paintings, and little ones, and had phases of them, and they're logically organized, and they're beautifully done, and they sort of, if spirits told me, they didn't tell me how to do it, but I'll get it from Art Nouveau, the spirals of Art Nouveau, or the geometry of Art Nouveau. But still, there's what the spirit said. There's all that content that came from the spirit. So one set of works at 15 years, and there's another 15 years project where she looks at the first 15 years work. That's an incredibly inspiring for now way to spend your life, which contains everything we just talked about. She's not mad, but she is talking to spirits, which we would think of as mad.
I think it's interesting how she's been really in the last few years. I think it's really good that she's been celebrated for her contribution to art making, and she's one of my faves. And I think that But I also think it's strange, like the sort of flip of it, like as you were talking about sort of mental health and kind of like supernatural discussions, because a lot of supernatural sort of events were attributed to kind of, again, this kind of hysterical females basically, and the idea of like a poltergeist or something was much more consumable than actually these people are really fucked off with the state of affairs. Do you know what I mean? And so I think that in another way, like sort of the limits of like art criticism and the way that the work's been contextualized, which is in some ways a really good thing, because it shows the sort of contribution historically of things which are not normative. But then in another way, it kind of it still raises sort of questions or like problems around how that stuff is contextualized within, you know, because I you know, she said it herself that was how the work came into being, and then maybe it's impossible to separate those two things. I don't know.
The two things being what?
Being kind of artistic concerns and a non-normative, either supernatural or mental health kind of thing.
Well,
yeah. I don't know.
If you think that what's not given to her as a achievement is that she's a political revolutionary.
Yeah.
Because she says, I deny your materialist world. I'm going to live in the world of the spirits.
Yeah.
And I'm not even going to be mad.
Yeah.
You can't even say I'm hysterical. I'm not even going to be in a clinic. And it's not even art. So she didn't even say that it was. It's very doubtful that she even thought of it as art. She didn't want to show it to anybody. I'm not even going to try and compete. I'm just going to do it here for the spirits. Because the point was to evolve humanity. Gregor, or whoever the spirit was, said, you won't know what these are. You can't know. You just got to do them. And their purpose is they will evolve humanity to the higher spiritual level, because that's a sort of theosophical desire that she knows about and she's interested in. But when she's packaged as a woman hero of art, that has limited sort of use in a way, although, you know, that's good to keep revising art history and see that there can be a woman who invented abstract art. But the greater idea of her breaks through the packaging anyway, or even the desire to package anything, because she's such a successful revolutionary and such a successful social naysayer. You know, absolutely everything is denied by her, and she doesn't even have to be put in a straitjacket. She can live out a whole life. And she suffers a few sort of humiliations. She tries to get Rudolf Steiner to like her stuff, and he doesn't. And that would be very hurtful to her, because she so much liked him and liked his theosophy. But the feeling of hope about art now is that art could actually be something like the sentimental idea of it that many people have. First thing you learn when you actually go to art school is, oh, that's not true about Chagall. He isn't actually a really good artist. And it's absolutely devastating, you know, and then you have to kind of remake yourself as this cynical person who just wants to get a gallery and be in an art magazine, you know. Then you think, oh God, what happened to my sincerity when I was 15, you know. I don't know if perhaps I'm only confessing my own story here, but, you know, maybe others can recognize this narrative. And then you realize that both things are in you, you know, because we have to strive and be successful and survive. And also we have, and in this being successful thing, we don't want to make a fool of ourselves. And then we have this other side that can actually respond to very, very sensitive art that existed in the past and is powerful and sensitive. And then we wonder, is it possible nowadays to have such kind of art? And again, we're told that it isn't. But, you know, there's signs that it could be.
I mean, you point out, for example, the example of Jeremy Corbyn's Labour, which has become more and more popular, despite a kind of overarching willfulness. I mean, we're beyond conspiracy. There's this kind of, people who run mainstream media hate the guy, and yet he maintains his popularity because what he's talking about as an idea is something like saying the market's out of control. It's gone mad. And I think there's a resonance perhaps of that occurring in art. Now, the great thing about art is you can talk about it and look back on it, and it's sort of a reflection of its time.
We make it make sense, I think, when we look back. As to whether it actually makes any sense at all, I have no idea. But I think that there's something about memory and looking back,
right?
And that you try and make it make sense in whatever way. So if that means raising a few things and putting a few things that weren't originally together, then it sort of streamlines it, because as humans we have a sort of conviction towards linearity. It's really comforting for humans to have a linearity, and I think sort of to bring it back to art making, that I don't know if there's the same sort of comfortable place of linearity anymore.
Right.
What do you mean by linearity?
Linearity, I mean sort of a flowing narrative that really makes sense. And I think certain writers like Kathy Acker coming back into kind of importance, who actually completely disregards the idea of a formal linear narrative, and actually absorbs interiority and then puts it back out there, through plagiarism, through all the things that you're not meant to do. And I think that the sympathy towards that is quite interesting currently. I don't know.
Well, sympathy is a good word, I think. That we re-sympathise with something that might have been discarded for a while.
But then I don't even think it is sympathy. I'd say empathy is a better word, because it's sympathy is something
we don't
which
pity
you're
her.
not experiencing yourself. But then empathy, like you were talking about with Corbyn and people becoming very empathetic towards him. I mean, he is what he is, especially in terms of ideological principles, which, I mean, I quite like them, but they are dressed up in a kind of, there's something glorifying about, there's a glory around it.
So people like being idealistic.
People, yeah.
Is that what you mean?
And I think that going back to the original point of sort of anxiety and ways out of anxiety, there's hope. I think, and how you spoke about the early sort of the late 19th century, and what started to happen there was the sudden re-emergence of utopia as an important thing within art making and architecture and social building. And obviously that went really, really wrong in so many cases. But there was an impulse in the beginning to kind of, there was a desire there.
Well, I think...
I don't know.
No, that's absolutely right. I mean, artists of my generation, even though they weren't necessarily intellectual, by osmosis, they soaked up the idea that any utopian thoughts or any idealism was laughable. And the intellectual inquiry that we got that from, although we weren't really capable of really reading it, was post-structuralism and to some extent structuralists really, but broadly postmodernism. Not that that's an evil body of work either, and that's a very, very useful body of work to examine. But we all kind of soaked up the idea, maybe it was a half-baked version of it, that all grand narratives had ended. And that included, of course, Marxism and socialism, but it also included Freudianism and capitalism. And I think that's really, when you say, well, why were artists ironic? We're all going to look back in shame on this period, whereas at the time we thought we were so clever, It's fantastic to be ironic. Because when you're talking, irony is a marvelous rhetorical device, and people who can use it with ease, we love them. They're attractive, Oscar Wilde, Shakespeare.
Yeah.
Wow. Virginia Woolf. But a vulgar sort of irony set in with art, where nothing meant anything. Everything, it was all reflections reflecting reflections. Nothing could ever be allowed to mean anything. And the only thing different to that seemed to be a risible and easily criticizable sentimentality. Whereas, I think the virtue of Peter Doig and Christophily, when they're good, is that they say, well, you could have a kind of art that actually is like Gauguin, not the Gauguin we've all got to hate now, but the Gauguin who's very good at, slowly baking colors, and slowly building up an image where things emerge through brushstrokes, and you're not really sure what you're looking at. There's a sort of fantasy of the South Sea Islands, but it's also a collection of greens and mauves and strokes and hatched lines and faces and gods and atmospheres. Once Doig and Ophelia kind of made themselves into little mini Gauguins, they actually even moved out to the Caribbean. But they're indicative of a tendency rather than the focus of the tendency. And the tendency is the willingness to believe that there is something beyond irony. And the thing beyond irony needn't be a shallow. That irony, what we had was vulgar irony. It wasn't a profound irony like you get in like Dostoevsky or something, a bitter irony. It's marvelous. It was a sort of shallow and silly irony. I was in the habit of using the word daft for a while because that's how I saw all that. Those YBAs were not my generation. They were younger than me, actually, and I found their company awkward. I didn't really hang out with them. But I did feel I knew what they were doing, and I liked the way that they explored certain sort of social taboos, and tested them. And can this be acceptable? Can even this be acceptable? Can even this be acceptable? But I didn't think there was much hope for it, really, as far as actual art went. And with what's been coming through in the last few years, me and Emma, our joint paintings are not figurative, and they're not really like dreams, and they're not really, they're very, very strictly bounded grids that have color relationships in them. But we work on them months and months and months, and we think of the colors as vibrating away with all the tangible reality of nature. So we think we're 1890s as far as William Morris goes.
Is it like a meditation, the process
I
of
don't
making
know.
them?
No, to make them it's purely, no, we're not meditating at all. We're practically putting one color next to another,
right.
Working out how to do it. We're narrowing right down just to do that. But we hope that the meaning, which we can't really control, is to do with nature. That it's a return of nature. We're doing landscapes, but without the landscape. We're just squashing these landscapes into geometric grids. Mm-hmm. And we hope that people who like them, they don't have to know why they like them or be able to talk about them intellectually, or even non-intellectually. But we think that they're liking them because they're getting some of that. They're thinking it's like the light in the sky, or the light on the glass, or the light on your face, or something. Even though it's only a triangle.
Yeah.
Anyway, the reason I bring them up is to say that where both of us are quite interested in, is this tendency of being open both to the history of art, to what it's like to be human. Human involves sort of seeing something significant in nature, actual nature, light and objects revealed by light, and then growth, things growing and dying, the cycles of nature. So being depressed about nature now being death-dealing, as opposed to being where life goes on, that you could actually die from nature. Nature's going to kill you now because of the way it's been distorted. That's a fair enough depression, I would say, and a fair enough reason to be anxious. And to think of art as, even if it's at one remove, it's not directly saying, look, here's the universe that's going to blow up, but it's giving you reason to think there's something wrong with the way society is set up that is remedied somehow in this painting. The painting doesn't spell out the thing that's wrong, but it offers you a way of being that's different to the way society is, which is what you're saying about the phenomenon of hysteria, that those women were in unbearable situations created by what we now call patriarchy. And their symptoms were creative flights. They were sort of flights to get away from the straitjackets that life had put them in. And in a way, these painters are kind of a reclaiming of hysteria or a positivizing of hysteria.
Because that thing also occurs, doesn't it, when you are talking to people who are suffering of very serious anxiety. Generally it's this, I need to get away from something. I need to escape from this situation. If I just go and live in Cornwall, I'll be all right. Or if I just leave this stressful job, I'll be all right. And I'm wondering whether, so you're kind of talking a bit about how art is also perhaps an escape from.
Yeah, but you don't want art to be
place.
a shallow, flabby escape for fools.
Right, yeah.
You know,
Right,
you want it to be like, if you think that religion can often be wrong, but when it's right, wow, that's a good idea. You know, incredible. You know, that's like everything is raised. You know, we're all raised. You think, well, you want art to be like that. So you don't want the religion of the Inquisition or of nasty-minded, nosy people who want to control you morally. You want the religion of the most fantastic gods and deities and spirits, you know, and the religion where everything is a god, where a blade of grass is a deity, you know, and a horse is an array of light is.
Yeah.
So you don't want art to be escapism. Everything else is real, and here's the silly thing that you can go to. You want art to have all the tough, tangible, meaningful sort of inexhaustibility of actual life, but it's all happening in some kind of material process. Like you've had to stretch up those little canvases, and then you have to think, how do you get this dab on here, and what's the point of a dab there? Is it supposed to relate to that dab, or is it just that you've got to fill up the area? I mean, there are different sort of degrees, even though you might be working unconsciously a lot, there are degrees of decisions that go into how you make a mark. And if one feels at the end that all those decisions are in some way apparent, or that one is reliving those decisions, it seems like one's own life, all the things that one does actually in life, all the rich unpredictability of a lived life.
I think it's quite problematic. I don't know if I don't think I reclaim hysteria, because I think that the term itself, I think, is really problematic. It's also problematic, I don't know, because that's part of my identity, obviously, like being identify as a woman, and so it's. I mean, it's an interesting. I think it's an interesting discussion, because I think that it's so that all the things, all the terms that we use are so entrenched within that. Then is not just enough to own it. Then I think that's why the sort of concept of labour is removed from, because it has that stuff, it has that obsessive stuff, it has the repetition, it has all the attributes of those anxious disorders.
Yes, but it's not disordered.
But it's embracing the disorder without the attribution of gender.
Right.
If you see what I mean.
I do.
Yeah.
And also, I don't mean to reclaim, you know, like when the word queer is reclaimed, it's not that you're reclaiming the derogating that the word, or the denial, or the assault that the word means.
Yeah.
You're reclaiming it in order to deny the denial, you know.
Yeah, it's kind of a bit, I don't know, it's a bit of a loop one.
Yeah.
But then, yeah, at the same time, I think it sort of, I don't know, it definitely raises questions around, like, when you were talking about how you make your paintings, in, you know, a sort of this return to nature, and the way it's quite, because it's not just what, we can't pick and choose between what parts of something that's beyond us is that we're going to take, but then maybe we do that, like instinctively, do you know what I mean? Because the death is part of nature as much as life is part of nature, and everything in between. And and those things are powerful and beyond human understanding.
Yeah, and when you're making a painting, frankly, you've got to narrow down.
Exactly.
If you think, well, I'm in the studio and I'm going to paint death today,
Yeah.
that's a bit of a tall order. You know.
Yeah.
But if you've got a sort of illustrational language like Arnold Böcklin or Max Beckmann or something, you could say I'm going to paint death because you've got a whole system going with symbols, or Nolde, Nolde as well, but Munch, fantastic artists who really do paint death very convincingly. But they're already working with systems of representation where it makes sense. But when you're working in a more or less abstract way, or when you've inherited a sort of typical art school experience, where really you work quite materially, you now write down everything that we've talked about, because we've been, like really scaling the heights and plumbing the depths. That has the potential of being in what you've done, but you can't necessarily decide you're going to do it. You have made some decisions about what you're going to do, and you've made some culturally political, political decisions in a cultural framework, as it were.
Yeah,
You've made choices about this and not that,
Yeah.
And even, as you said right at the beginning, scale has been a political decision for you in a way, that you don't want to do the
imperial thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I think, yeah. Yeah, I don't know. It's like, I think that deciding like to paint something so big and but then sort of accessing that through like your registers, through your languages, like all of that sort of stuff. I suppose that's really where we're at, that we're sort of trying to find these like communal languages that sort of, I don't know.
You might decide to paint something so big because you've got big paintbrushes.
Yeah, there's so many reasons and variables, yeah.
That woman, I think, is very good, Jade Fajatumi, who had a show at Pier, paints very big. And a lot of it is the materials. It's like gallons of liquid and big brushes, and working in a chaotic mess on your knees in front of a canvas, leaning on the floor, and doing this. But it starts to be very calligraphic. The marks have that horrible liquid yellowness. It's really horrible, but actually it's very beautifully sort of controlled just because of the narrowing. These are the materials I'll narrow down to what I think I can do. And all the brutal things I just mentioned fall away. And the whole thing, 8 foot, 12 foot wide, and it's a very sensitive calligraphic journey all across the canvas that just sort of works. And she's like thinking this and that and writing little things. And she's only 26. And that's an incredibly vibrant, believable painting that would look great with your paintings, even though they're very different. And I think you're both tuning into the same interest which exists in the different dimensions of the art world as such, in art schools, in galleries, art critics, artists in their studios are all sort of picking up on it a bit, that you can write something out, it can be believable. You could have a painting could be like a poem, things that would have seemed embarrassing 20 years ago, that might have been lively ideas in the 1930s in surrealism, but would have taken a very different form because there are other things going on with art.
Yeah.
So there's two things going on. One is an interest in the psyche, but the other is that we inherit, when we can't help it, art school experience. A white spirit container is like that. It's that big. There's that much white spirit. You can get brushes that are very, very big, and you're less likely to be using these little brushes. You have to make a very conscious decision to use a little brush. It's a weird decision. On the whole, and then you get these big rolls of cotton duck, and there's all sorts of habits, art school habits, which just feed in a way that they wouldn't have done in the 1930s, because there were different technological circumstances, and wouldn't have done in the 1890s because everyone was either an aristocrat or they emulated an aristocratic way of life. And they bought canvases according to certain dimensions of Belgian linen from the canvas maker. So there's technological considerations, and there's certain moods that art goes through, and then there's things that the world is doing, and that art can't help but respond to.
I wonder if anyone's got any questions, whether we should open up and figure out if anyone's got any kind of responses to some of the things that we've been talking about. Are there any artists here tonight? Is anyone else a practicing artist, I suppose? Yeah?
Went through the art school experience together. We did the art school experience together. And I think it's actually really interesting because even though, on a couple of levels, even though you have these big rolls of cotton duck, these big potential brushes and all of that, those things still cost money.
Yes.
And an art school education now costs a hell of a lot of money.
Yeah.
Living costs, like we are in those times where those decisions are sometimes as much, about finances. But they're also to do with like, it's on a very perfect personal level, but they're also to do with like choices about what we make and how we make, and can we justify like using those materials?
Yeah.
Like I think those
Yeah.
are like really big considerations.
And is that kind of is there an anxiety about that? What did you say? The justification of using those materials?
Yeah.
If we're producing so much and there's so much
Would seem crass. Yeah. Could easily seem crass.
It's
Yeah.
like, I think we now have no idea about that concept of like throwing things away.
Yeah.
Where is away?
Yeah.
So I think there is an interesting sort of psyche shift.
There is absolutely. There's an alteration, definitely. Yeah. Yeah.
As someone who does use very small brushes, but I think it's more complicated.
What do you think?
Yeah, I'm in the small brush crew.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh, we can see.
definitely.
Yeah. Well, you made a decision, didn't you?
Yeah, which is weird because I used to want to make my paintings so big. I was like,
Yeah.
not big enough, like
Yeah.
billboard sized. And I
Yeah.
think, I mean, it's different for every person. Everyone's got their reasons, and maybe just the sort of the language of justification is such like an art school product. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
In itself, like, and a certain handed down of like certain types of logic and reasoning as to why you're doing this. Because I mean, ultimately, it is like to be in a position where you're able to make art is a privilege, and I think that people do it for all different reasons, and not necessarily even going to art school. That's not enough reason to sort of like identify someone as an artist. But I totally think that sort of shift around like material, and it's even if it's not kind of like an obvious shift in terms of like no more big paintings ever, it's a consideration.
Yeah.
Which feels different to like, big 80s painting or something where it was, really mirrored the kind of economic systems of like growth and like decadence and like freedom in basically exploiting material as an artist.
Yeah. Well, certainly a depraved idea of freedom. But some of those artists are very creative about reflecting that back, actually, I think.
Yeah, because I don't think necessarily like, that like large and free and all the rest of it is necessarily a depraved concept.
No, absolutely.
No,
but
and actually,
coming from
depravity in itself is not a bad thing.
No. But coming from the political idea of freedom was basically freedom to show up and be a Christian, be an American Christian.
Yeah.
We're going to defeat those Arab countries and we're going to give them freedom. Or we're going to defeat the USSR and give them freedom. They can now do as much shopping as they like.
Yeah, moralistic imperialism.
Yeah.
But I think also it's quite interesting because, like, like speaking what we were talking about earlier, like end of capitalism thing, like, because we can't ever conceive of the end because that's the catastrophe, but we can sort of have an idea about, start to have an idea about what a change in something might look like, because one thing's ended and something else has begun. But I think, what you were talking about in terms of time frames of like post-structural like philosophy and stuff.
Yeah.
It was kind of the end because it was the end of communism in a lot of places.
That's right.
Do you know what I mean? Or at least the beginning of the end in other places.
Yeah.
And
The end of communism seemed to be a real life event which supported the theories of postmodernism. At least the theories such as that people thought those theories were. I mean, the actual post-structuralist writers are very good writers and good analysts, but what came down to us as a sort of idea of their idea was certainly supported by the end of communism. Yeah. But as what you were saying, my feeling is that if it wasn't that Labour's going to end all the student fees thing, I think people shouldn't go to art school. They should start their own underground groups,
No, totally. And I'm not. It's just like these things are all factors that
totally they are. Yeah. Well, my daughter's 30 and she's an artist actually, and she's half German, so she lives in Berlin. But me and Em, my wife, we were always giving her our stretchers, and she was always like super conscious about every inch of cotton duck, and she only ever had like 6 brushes, whereas we'd like have 2,000 and not clean them, and she was sort of living embodiment of a change to us. I don't know what that says about us. Maybe.
Does anyone else have any contributions, questions? Yes, sir.
Hello.
Go for it. Yeah.
Transfixed by your the way you three are dressed colour-wise. Very unifying with the t-shirts and with the dull blue.
Yeah, we look like a
That's
band.
all West Ham Aston Villa palette, which I'm guessing somebody's got green underwear on because you match the trim shape, the flesh and the trim shape that you are, you match the trim shape behind on the wall. And it's just,
It was all coordinated
got
through
purple
emails
underwear.
beforehand. Yeah. Thank you. Anyone else?
Very good
Comments about our-
intervention.
yeah.
Thank you.
Going back to Matthew's point just now, so if you think, if you encourage, I guess, artists or starting off artists not to go down the traditional route of art schools, starting their own, underground movement, which sounds incredible, but then what? After, how do they then hit the market if that was something that they
Who knows if there'll be a market? That,
But so do you think there needs to be kind of a change in
yeah, I think people should create their own cultures more. I think there was a thing it probably still exists, but there was a thing in the early 2000s called Mad Pride, where people who'd been in psychiatric care all sort of came out and went on marches being proud of being mad. And I think you could be proud of being an artist and not feel that the identity of an artist has to be given to you either by the market or by an art school. But as to what that identity would be, who knows? And then how you would live, who knows? In the periods of Bohemia, which we think was timeless, but were actually very specific, they're more like the middle of the 19th century and then petering out in the 1950s, really. Lasted about 100 years. In Bohemia, people didn't really know how they were going to live. and that's exciting in a way, but it's also a little bit awful because it involves philanthropy from aristocrats. So it's not for nothing that in the Bohemian mythology, there are some criminals, there are some aristocrats, and there's some creative people. They all mill around, but without the aristocrats, there's no gold. Everyone's going to die. So you are, as Clement Greenberg once said, art is tied by an umbilical cord of gold to wealth, really, to wealth and power. So in a new age, how would you be an underground artist? Because you're going to have different systems everywhere. Of course, there will be philanthropists, because that's what art collectors are. They give their money to artists. Never mind that they also speculate with the art. but that's where the money comes from. And but we don't really know how the plates are going to shift now. You know, we were told when the Tories and the Lib Dems came in 2010 that you're not going to get any grants, and your grants are going to be taken away. You actually got to pay now to go to art school. And no institution, no cultural institution, you get grant. You're going to have an American model where you rely on philanthropy. And even then, by 2010, you were already seeing those names, lists of names in the big cultural institutions. And among them were people that you knew to be arms dealers or gangsters, you know, but you're told, well, that's the way it's going to be. And that has been the way, you know, for the last 10 years, been an escalating, you know, talking about depraved, this is like the worst kind of, you know, the best thing, art and culture, is sort of run by the worst people. But we don't know how it's going to come now. When you start thinking, well, I don't have enough canvas, but I have loads of ideas, you know, well, then maybe you don't need canvas, you know. And there have been points in even relatively recent history where you've had cultures of art that we now find very exciting and interesting, which it turns out they were very poor people, you know, like the Russian dissident artists in the 70s, I guess in a lot of the former behind the Iron Curtain countries, you know. But in any situation of poverty around the world, there's been very, very exciting cultural ideas based on a situation much more frightening than the one we have. Because our situation hasn't really been frightening because we've been complacent. We haven't been able to see how frightening it is. We only now see that. That's what all this, when centrists say, oh my God, if only we could have it to before 2016, if only when everyone was rational. What they mean is, let's go back to the 40 years of turning a blind eye to world exploitation and how most of the people in the world lived in hell, you know, but the Westerners were fine. Let's go back to that. But you can't have that anymore because the cracks have just appeared, and you've suddenly got this extreme situation where it's either right-wing, incredibly frightening people are going to be running you with their racism and their corporatism, or you're going to fight that. Well, how do you fight it? You know, so you have to adopt something called socialism. Whoa, that boring old silly thing, you know, that existed ages ago and was crusty old cranky people. You have to sort of start believing in it or voting for it or something. You don't know what it's going to be. So every bit of what used to be a system is now changing. And that includes how to be an artist. How, you know, if you're 30 years old, in 1983, you knew exactly how you were going to be an artist. Everyone did. And even 10 years ago, there might have been a bit of a wobble because suddenly no one was getting any grants anymore. So fewer and fewer working class people were in art schools, and the range of social types in art schools started to narrow a lot because simply lack of money. Anyway, so that was a fantastic story I was telling, but I'm not really sure what the end of it was, or what I was answering. Oh no, I was answering you about, what then? Yeah, if you make your own culture. Well, I think what my story was about, you don't necessarily have to worry too much. You've got to survive in some way. And my illustration about the Bohemians is that they survived because there was always going to be a Peggy Guggenheim or a philanthropist somewhere in there, who themselves were quite eccentric people. But we don't know what's going to come up now. And so it's a good question, but there's no real answer to it, except that you might have to embrace uncertainty a bit. But, you know, when I went to art school, I didn't know how anyone did anything. You know, you just, there has to be a certain amount of making it up as you go along with whatever the circumstances offer. Yeah, sorry, that's just like a totally ordinary answer, and I made you listen to the very long story about nothing.
Anyone else? Should we wrap it up before we drift off? What do you think? Thank you very much. Thank you for your time. Thanks for your brains. Thanks for your thoughts.
Very nice.
And your ideas. And I hope we've all got something out of it. We've gone on a bit of an ramble journey. And thank you all for coming. because otherwise we'd just be here on our own, and that'd,
Yeah.
be, that'd be weird. So yeah, thanks a lot. Thank you.